Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is a very important week for us, and yesterday was an exceptionally important day. It was the actual signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act on July 26th. My name is Shami Carr. I'm an advocate at the Disability Rights Center, and I'm very happily joined by my colleague and friend, Julian Henley. Julian?
Good morning, all. My name is Julian Henley Sr. I'm the ADA coordinator for the government of the Virgin Islands. It's a pleasure being here with you, Shami, and our guests.
Sounds great. So Julie and I are kind of geeks about this. We could talk about ADA all day, 365 days of the year.
You got
But,
it.
but the good thing is that we really make a concerted effort in the territory to bring forward information about your rights and about the importance of the ADA, and additionally different services that we offer. And at the end, we'll talk about that. Both Julie and I will talk about our services, as well as some other resources and information that's available throughout the territory. So
Right.
with that, I wanted to ask the first question. Oops, get this PowerPoint going. Well, before we start, I'm sorry. This is actually a public online forum, meaning that we are recording this. And so we'll be on our YouTube channel. So we want to be cognizant and mindful to let the audience know not to ask too many personal questions, certainly no disclosure of disability. If it's complicated, please save those questions for us. You can email myself. You can email Julian. We'll be happy to talk with you or email you a response. You can ask questions, but that will be in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. Feel free to interrupt us during the presentation. We're happy to take any questions at any time. We will have an evaluation at the end of the presentation, and I will hand that over to Kishma, who is with us to give some further instructions about the evaluation. Just want to put the little disclaimer for us, since we are a legal center as well, that this event is intended to give you, not intended to give you legal advice. The purpose of this event is to educate you about your rights under the ADA. Okay, a little bit of housekeeping. Now we'll give you an overview of the agenda, which is we're going to talk about the ADA in general, a little bit of history. I'll be talking about Title I, and then Julian will talk about Title II and Title III, and we'll end it with Q&A and some resources. Okay. Julian, is there anything you'd like to say before we start?
No, I'm all excited.
Okay, sounds good. Just a little tidbit about us, DRCVI. We do have offices on both islands. We have our phone number, email, webpage. We provide, as I mentioned, we are a legal center, but we also provide non-legal advocacy. I myself is a non-legal advocate. We do a ton of information referrals, just like Julian, and we do outreach to many different stakeholder groups like parents, students, employers, the government, and the community at large. That's us at DRCVI. Okay? So that's now, I jumped ahead a little bit, but in terms of the first polling question, and we don't actually have a poll, but if people could raise their hands, and Kishma, if you could help facilitate that, because on my screen, I'm not able to see any hands raised. But I want to ask the first question to everybody out there is, I know all the titles of the ADA. So if you could just raise your hand if you do know, and Kishma, if you could report to us what that looks like. Did anybody raise their hands?
At present, there are no hands raised.
Okay. Okay, so that's kind of a boo yay. It's a boo because I wish people did know more about the ADA, but it's a yay because, of course, now you will learn about the ADA. So we don't see that as a bad thing. It's something that certainly as people with disabilities advocates, it's crucially important that you know the ADA. It is the most comprehensive civil rights law for people with disabilities. Okay, it's crucially important. So we're going to go over this so you will know all the titles. Okay. In the chat box or raise of hands, does anybody know any of these people in the picture, minus the president, just by chance? It's a very important picture. Anybody? And again, Kishma, if you could let me know, because I can't see the chat box. Okay, a little trick question. The guy on the I guess it would be on our right. He's got a hat on. He's in a wheelchair. His name is Justin Dart, and it's very important to know who he is because he's really the father of the independent living movement, and he is right there with President George H.W. Bush talking and signing the ADA in the front lawn. So this is a crucially important picture. People have probably seen it before. The person next to him, which is very important too, his name is Chairman at the time, Chairman Kemp. He was the chairman of the EEOC, which is the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And I mention this specifically because people with disabilities absolutely made Title I, the first section, because of so much employment discrimination. So they made sure that the commissioner of EEOC was right there as well for the signing. Okay, just a little bit of tidbit and trivia there for you. Okay. You know what, let me go back. I do apologize. I meant to actually, and if you want a copy of it, I can give you the full structure of the ADA, but let me at least mention that there are 5 titles. And the first title is employment. The second is places of public, state and local government. Title 3 is places of public accommodations. Title 4 is telecommunication, and Title 5 is a catch-all or an administrative title, which has things like exemptions in the ADA, different state relationships, and some legal things for attorneys. Okay. Okay, so let's just take a quick walk down, not a very good memory lane. This is having to do with the history of people with disabilities. And it really has been a very, I think most people know that it's been a very, very bad and a very sad story, dating all the way back to the 1700s. If we talk about kind of modern times, where that's actually where the word handicap came from in the 1800s, because people with disabilities were not allowed to work, so they had to have hand in cap. That's also when they had the ugly laws, and they were also in the United States too, these ugly laws. It's very interesting. Of course, unfortunately, that encompassed people with disabilities if they had anomaly, if they had amputation, you know, if there's any kind of form, a feature that was just different, and they would fall under that. And sometimes they would be institutionalized. Some people were killed. And again, this was not just in Britain, this was also in America. Most people with disabilities were, again, hidden or killed. It was a very, very scary and a very terrible time. In the late 1800s to the end of World War, we started to see a shift in terms of how people with disabilities were viewed. Instead of being someone who is a pauper or someone who is a disease to society, now, and particularly because of veterans, now they were actually seen more as a human being, a citizen, as where someone would go to, say in this case, a soldier would go to war, and they would come back and maybe they had lost their leg, or maybe they can't walk again, but they were still seen as a human and as a citizen. And that really started to shift the paradigm into more of a medical model. Instead of being like, this is a pity model, or, you know, this is a you know, God willed it model. Now we've gotten into more of a medical model where it's like, okay, there's a medical situation and it just needs to be fixed. And that is much better than the previous model, but it really wasn't still the best model, but we were moving in the right direction. And then in the 1840s to the 1940s till 1960s, the medical model and institutions and eugenics were very prevalent. This is also very terrifying because a lot of Americans were roped into the eugenics movement. Disability certainly at the top of it, but so were orphans, so were some women, certainly anybody with any kind of medical, as they call it, abnormality. And this was very popular, this movement, and unfortunately it shaped a lot of the policies, both in terms of social and medical, and it had some implications right up until about the 1700s, okay? 1960s to 1990s started to have this whole civil rights movement, and as we know, the 1964 Act, the Civil Rights Act, did not include people with disabilities, but it certainly started the fire to now have that also be part of the civil rights movement as a protected class, and that's of course people with disabilities. So the Rehab Act and the Special Education Law, which were in the 70s, started to build that platform of civil rights. And then 1990, when the ADA came, it absolutely kind of buttoned that up and said, we're going to make it very comprehensive. It's not just going to be for entities that receive federal funding. It's not going to be just in schools. It's going to be all of America. In this case, all of the places that the public goes to, whether they're going to work, whether they're going to the state and local government, whether they're going to a business. Okay. So again, this was obviously a very huge landmark. And we are still in well, I call the next stage, the 1900s, still till now, we're still in the civil rights model, but with a heavier emphasis on things like accessible IT. And I know Julian can talk about that also, like in the government, they're making sure that their platforms are accessible. We just had a recruitment roundtable yesterday where the recruiter was talking about their website. So in the 1990s, you know, the internet really wasn't had like that, but now it now, because it's so pervasive, that they have actually a law also for accessible IT, and that's Section 508 of the Rehab Act, right? Buildings, again, in the Virgin Islands, there's a lot of historical buildings. There are provisions to address that. And certainly the terrain and topography is very tough in the Virgin Islands, but buildings and building codes, and again, something that Julian works very closely with the building code people and variances to address that and to continue to address that, because again, it goes back to universal access. And workplaces, as we know with the pandemic particularly, that has pushed the new kind of workplace into a remote learning and working. And for us in the field of disability, we asked for this back in 2007. EEOC did an enforcement guidance talk about telework as a form of reasonable accommodation. And now here we are almost 13 years later, still asking and talking, 15 years later, still talking about this as a form of not just reasonable accommodation, but now it is what's almost expected as a hybrid workplace. Many workplaces are not going to go back to fully physically in the workplace. So this is something, again, off the backs of people with disabilities, something we've been asking for many years. And we're just, I guess, glad at this point that it's rolled out very nicely. And for some people with disabilities, working remotely, it is the best option. Okay. So that's just a quick walk down history. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. So before, in terms of understanding the ADA, there's some common themes throughout the ADA that we want to make sure that you have a good understanding, because no matter what title we're talking about, it's going to apply for each one of them. Okay, and I do have the titles there. I'm sorry, thought I'd left them out, but they're right there, I see. So on the left-hand side, we have 4 common themes, and we just want to break them down a little bit so that you make sure that as you are looking at the ADA, as you're applying it, you understand that some of these situations could arise, and again, will be thematic. So first is definition of disability. So a person with a disability under the ADA is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And that definition can also be broken down, but we don't need to get that technical today. The main thing that you need to know as a person with disability or as an advocate is that it's self-attesting, that you look at the definition and you say, yes, I see myself in that definition. 2, there's no exhaustive list. Okay, people ask all the time, and I know they asked Julian too, is there a list for ADA? Where is the ADA list? There is no ADA list. We have common disabilities we think about, such as people with medical conditions like cancer and MS, and people who have physical disabilities who may use a wheelchair or use crutches, people who have mental health disabilities who may have anxiety and bipolar and autism. So there's a large spectrum. Even within the disabilities themselves, like autism, there's still a spectrum within that disability. So definition of disability, most important for you to understand is that it's self-attesting, that there's no exhaustive list, and also that there's a couple of other parts to it. I don't want to get too specific about it, but it is good to know that you can be discriminated if someone regards you as a person with a disability. So for example, if you have been a burn victim and you may have some facial anomalies or some hand anomalies, someone might say, oh, looks like you're disabled, you need accommodations, but you didn't ask for any, you don't need any, you just happen to have, this type of medical situation, but they're regarding you as, and they treat you as that, you do have a right under the law that you have been discriminated, okay? You can also have a record of a disability, and a record of a disability, the examples I use, for example, is if you've been in special education, if you've ever had a 504 plan, if you have been rehabbed with drugs or alcohol, or if you have had cancer in the past and you're in remission. Those are all record of a disability, and sometimes that can qualify you to be a person under the ADA as well, okay?
Excuse me, Ms. Carr.
Yes.
Question. Can you please explain Title 5?
Sure. So what I'll do is, I'll do that right now then. Title 5 is kind of a catch-all, as we call it, administrative title. It really is for things like attorneys, if they have to do a litigation, it gives them some provisions and some technical requirements. It also talks about exclusion. As an example, Section 508, not of the Rehab Act, but of the ADA, is exclusionary clause, meaning who is not included in the ADA, people like kleptomaniac and transvestite and gambling. So some examples of exclusion, and that's under Section 508 of the ADA. And there's some things called abrogation, which means override. So there's some information about that for state and federal abrogation and who can override who and where does that kind of fit. So those are just some examples of what's in that. It's nothing that people usually train on because it's just a catch-all. Julian, is there anything you wanted to add with section?
No, you covered it all, and actually you add a lot more to it. It's really a catch-all. It's a miscellaneous act. So the ADA continues to have amendments and different things that's being added as they move along. Like 508 came out in 2018. You know, so you have these administrative or other admin to the law. So we continue to monitor and learn what's in Title V, but most of our focus is on Title I, II, III, and IV.
Correct. Did you have any more questions with Title V?
Not at this time. Thank you.
We'd be happy to, after the presentation, to give you a nice overview. We have one through our partner, our collaborator with the Northeast ADA Center. Their national project has a great 3-page overview. Be happy to send that as a follow-up after this presentation. Okay? So another common theme is discrimination. So no matter if you're being discriminated at work under Title I, discriminated under Title II with state and local government, or if you're discriminated under Title III with businesses and even potentially Title IV, that definition stays the same throughout the ADA. So again, this is again a common, can't say a phrase, but it's a common word that typically, if you feel that you've been discriminated, these are the ones that will fall under all of the categories, except of course for Title V. Now, undue hardship is very important to know because again, it applies for all the titles. There's two parts to undue hardship. One is cost. If it costs too much, the accommodation or modification, then that entity or that employer or business or even state and local government has a right to say this is an undue hardship. Another undue hardship or another part of undue hardship is fundamentally altering the operations of the business or program. So again, if it doesn't cost too much, but it's fundamentally altering the nature of the program or service, then that's a hardship too. That also falls under Title I because if the employer says the accommodation is causing hardship, meaning cost too much or is changing our services, then that's how Title I can also handle undue hardship, okay? So it is in a way a justification so that covered entities, again, employers, state and local governments and places of accommodation, they're called covered entities, that they do have this right, that if it's too hard, they do have this undue hardship clause, okay? And the last one I want to mention is retaliation, and that you can deal with retaliation under Title I with an employer. You can deal with that under Title II and Title III and potentially Title IV, okay? So we just wanted to give you an overview of the common themes before we dive into the actual ADA and make sure that you kind of have a little bit of a basis of some of the applications that we'll be talking about.
And Shami, undue hardship also touch on sometimes if you ask for an accommodation and that accommodation is something, for instance, you want a special model of equipment and that equipment that you're asking for, it's equal to what they might have online. It does, the equipment that they have probably produces the same needs for that employer. Then at times they will consider that, depends on the difference of that being undue hardship, because it is that you just like a model. It doesn't make the job that you need to do much better.
Exactly, exactly. And I think the illustration that we always use is that you may want the Cadillac, but you're probably just going to get.
Correct.
I don't want to insult any other car, but you get the point. You know, it's not always the brightest and the shiniest. I will say though, and I'll wait for when we talk about Title I, there is a way that you can cost share so you can potentially get the Cadillac. So, okay. So let's go on. If there's barring no questions, we'll go on to just jumping into the ADA. Again, I'm going to do Title I, then I'm going to hand it over to Julian for Title II and III. Okay, so the first thing about Title I, which is very important to know as a person with disability, whether you're already in the workplace or you're looking for work. Okay, and as I mentioned, Title I, the reason that it's the first title is because of the rampant employment discrimination that people with disabilities were dealing with in 1990. Okay, so the first one is prohibitive questions. These are questions that cannot be asked in an interview, cannot be asked on an application, hard copy or online. They cannot ask you, do you have a disability? They cannot ask you, have you been hospitalized? They cannot ask, have you ever filed workman's compensation? Or are you taking any medication? They cannot solicit from you anything that is disability in nature. What can they ask you? They can ask one phrase and one phrase only, and they must ask everybody, and it must be on every application, okay, which is, can you do the essential functions of the job? Now, some people say and add with or without accommodations, but the essential functions of the job is the most important when it comes to this whole title, really, because if you can't do the essential functions, even with accommodations, then you're not qualified under the ADA as a person with a disability, because Title I, you have to not just meet definition, but you also have to be qualified, okay? Now, disclosure, you might be people online that have obvious disabilities, but may have people have non-obvious. And disclosure is a very important decision to make. I will tell you through research that most people with disabilities do not disclose unless they have to for the purpose of reasonable accommodation, okay, which I think makes common sense. It is your choice to disclose. You do not have to disclose, only if you need reasonable accommodation. If you see if you see that question on application, if your supervisor asks you directly, or anybody in the workplace, you have a right to talk to someone about potential discrimination or violation of your rights. Because if you didn't disclose and they found out you had disability, or if the paperwork wasn't handled right upon disclosure, then that is a violation of your rights, because confidentiality is the number one when it comes to disclosure, and that is a right that you have, and it's a responsibility of the employer to make sure that your paperwork, particularly documentation of disability, is confidential. Like I mentioned, most people only disclose for the purpose of reasonable accommodation. Documentation, now this is very important. Even if you're in the workplace or you're thinking about work, do not ever sign a release from an employer to get documentation of disability. Be in control of your documentation. You also do not need to include a diagnosis. Let's say that you have bipolar, but you don't want to disclose, but you want to just say, I have a mental health disability. That's fine. Let's say that you might have AIDS, AIDS or HIV. You don't want to disclose that. I have a medical condition. Okay, there are ways to do that so that you protect yourself as much as you can, but you're also doing the requirements and the rights that the employer have in terms of getting documentation of disability. If you are in one of those categories, please give us a call, myself or Julian. We'll kind of talk you through how to protect yourself, but still be in compliance to get that reasonable accommodation, because it can be a little bit tricky, okay? And as I mentioned, medical and disability documents must be kept separately from human resource ones. So this is a responsibility of the employer to make sure that they do not mingle and mix your HR, whether it's HR performance, evaluations, your onboarding paperwork, mixing it with your medical or disability documentation that goes in a separate file, in a separate, even at times separate locations. Okay? So disclosure can be very tricky. Again, this is a conversation that if you're not sure how you'll have it with the employer, you please give us a call. We will walk you through it. We will talk you through it. And we will definitely get you feeling very confident. So when you do disclose, 100% what you're saying, how you're saying it, and what you're asking for. Okay? Kishma, any questions yet in the audience?
Not at present. And a reminder, so attendees, if you have a question or a comment, you can raise your hand at any time, or you can put it in the chat.
Great. All right, thank you, Kishma. So let's talk about reasonable accommodation. And obviously this is the whole really heart of Title I. Reasonable accommodation is obviously the phrase meaning reasonable, and that's what we try to teach and guide people to know. As for things that are reasonable, kind of going back to what Julian said about the Cadillac. Is the Cadillac reasonable? If you can just get the little, the little one, would that still be effective for you to do your essential functions? Okay, and then accommodation is just an adjustment that to something that's customarily done. Okay, so something that you're changing, but not drastically. Okay, so let's talk about the process. you or the employer can initiate the process. And what does that mean when I say the employer? Now, let's say that, and I'll use myself as an example. I have degenerative disc disease. And if I go into an employment situation and there's good ergonomics and I'm able to stand up a lot and stretch and do what I need to do, I don't have to disclose anything. But if I'm in a place where it's not like that, then I have to decide if I'm going to disclose. Now, let's say the employer has noticed that my performance isn't as good and they say, Shami, there's a problem with your workflow or you don't seem to be as productive, then I can say to them, well, let me disclose to you that I have this disc disease. It's very painful. And maybe if I could get some reasonable accommodation, like ergonomic chair, I have a feeling my work productivity will be better. So they can initiate it too. But if you haven't disclosed to them, they can't ask you, even on the job, they can't ask you, do you have a disability? They have to say, is there a problem? Is there a situation going on? I've noticed your work performance has suffered. That's how they can initiate that. And you as a person with disability then has a right and a responsibility to say, I am struggling with this due to disability. That's a right that you have to make sure that you are not penalized for not meeting the essential functions because you can do it. That's your right with accommodations, okay?
One question,
sure.
Shami, I'm sorry.
No.
Do you need to be diagnosed to receive accommodations?
You know, that's a good question in the sense that I just talked about you don't need a diagnosis, but so let me, typically you do. And I say that simply because there are a number of people that can provide documentation of disability for you. It doesn't have to just be your doctor or a specialist. It can be a psychologist. It can be your vocational rehab specialist, okay? Now, they're not doctors, but for their program, you do have to provide documentation of disability. So in that respect, if you want your vocational rehab specialist to provide that information, they can do that. And that's not necessarily coming from a medical entity, which means therefore it's not a diagnosis. So it's kind of a catch 22. But typically I would say 9 out of 10 times you would have a diagnosis. Okay. Did that answer your question?
And if you have an obvious disability, for instance, if you're blind or you're in a wheelchair or, you know, and then that's where you might not need, unless it's something special or that falls in between your obvious disability and what you're required to help you to continue doing your job. So that's the only areas where, as under Title I, you might not have to, but it's always good if you know you have that diagnosis and you're applying for a job. It's always good for you to walk with your paperwork and just what you're asking for the accommodation. That's the only paperwork that you should be. You shouldn't have them going through your whole medical files.
Right.
Like Shami said, you control your paperwork at all times.
At all times. And to the point that Julian just said is kind of walking with it, is that if you know you need reasonable accommodation and you don't want to disclose it, because again, you have a right to say, yes, I can do the essential functions of the job with accommodation. Again, they could ask that at the interview. And then once you get on the job and then you disclose, yes, I do have a disability and here's my documentation of disability, that just quickens the process. It just absolutely quickens the process. So that's really crucially important. Again, not only are you in control of your documentation, but you're actually quickening the process too. So 2 good reasons why to keep your information close at hand. Okay. The interactive process includes both the employer and the employee. And I wanted to use this language because when I talk to people with disabilities and advocates, I use the same language that EEOC uses for the employers. No, you know, we have to level the playing field to make sure when they talk about it, you know exactly what they're talking about. So the interactive process is basically what it means. It's a conversation that's just not one way, okay? And it has to include the employer and it has to include the employees. It's a right and a responsibility of both parties. Many a times, employers have fallen flat and have been sued because they didn't participate in the interactive process. We've heard this from EEOC tell us that. that many of the claims that people with disabilities put forward under Title I is because the lack of the interactive process. So I want to really bring that home and make sure you know that's a right that you have, but it's also a responsibility, okay? Most accommodations cost less than $500 and some are free. Again, if you're a person with disability and you're kind of worried about like, oh, they're gonna think it's gonna cost too much and maybe you don't even know how much it costs, but then you might figure out it actually doesn't cost anything. Rearranging furniture doesn't cost anything. Flexible schedules don't cost anything. You know, so there are things that cost absolutely nothing, all the way to maybe some kind of software. Julian mentioned someone who might have visual disability. Maybe they need a screen reader. But let me share with you, and I'd be curious to know of who is connected with Voc Rehab, because Voc Rehab can also, and it's the next bullet, can help share the cost. Meaning, let's say that the Cadillac you want for screen reader, JAWS or something, costs like $4,000. And the employer's like, oh God, I don't know, you know, they're thinking, oh God. Well, you know what? Voc Rehab might be able to pick up the whole cost or half the cost. So again, that's where Voc Rehab is really a nice partner for you as another advocate and resource, because they can help offset some of the issues and costs that is related to reasonable accommodation in the workplace. Okay? And just to wrap this section up with reasonable accommodation, again, I just want to give you some examples, and Julian, feel free to chime in for sure. I think I've talked about telework quite a bit now, about the EEOC guidance that came out in 2007 and how important that was then. It's even more important now. That is a form of reasonable accommodation. Reassignment, again, that costs nothing. Again, that gets a little tricky in a unionized environment. So I don't know if anybody's in a union environment, but reassignment is something that was more recent in the last 10 years that has risen to the top as a form of reasonable accommodation. And EEOC did put some guidance because it was getting a little bit messy again with the unions. Maintenance of accessible features, and that is a form of reasonable accommodation. And Julian, I'm going to use you as an example, because where Julian works, there's an elevator that's been down for years. I mean, years. And that's such a problem, because under the ADA, there's a provision called maintenance of accessible features. And if the elevator is down, that is an accessible feature and they have to maintain that, okay? So if you're in a workplace, if you're in a shopping place, or even state and local government, if they have things like ramps that aren't being operable or being blocked, you have elevators that are out, you have other kinds of lifts and they're out, that's a violation, because maintenance of accessible features, again, I'm talking about Title I, but again, this is another one that applies to all of the titles in terms of potential discrimination and violation.
And one of the things that you find, sometimes you might go to a place where there's a lift and the lift is locked, but this is a place that you're going to traverse every day. They should have the contact information there at that lift. If they're locking it for security reasons, and but you get there, you have no idea who to call to come and unlock the lift, then that's a reason, an accommodation that they should put in place, a way for you to contact the person who operates or controls that key, that, you know, when you reach there, that you don't have to go through, you know, a whole process to find that person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, you just made me think of something else that we recently heard, and Jen, I believe you were there too, when a young person was talking about the access to bathrooms and having to deal with keys. And, you know, again, it's not necessarily maintenance of accessible features, but to Julian's point, if you need certain access to accessibility, like an accessible bathroom, and it's locked, that's not very reasonable to not give that person an extra key, or as Julian said, the immediate contact information. So if you're dealing with any of these situations, again, give us a call. We will talk you through this and make sure your rights aren't being violated, and also give you some additional accommodation ideas. Okay. So trainings. This is so crucially important for employees, because you're always trying to either upgrade your skills, or maybe you want that promotion, or even if you want a lateral move and you need some trainings, whatever that is, the trainings that are provided need to be in an accessible manner. So if you're a person with a visual disability, if you're a person with ADHD, if you're a person with LD, maybe in terms of autism, maybe you got some sensory issues, or you're deaf, hard of hearing, these are types of situations where trainings can be modified or adjusted, again, in an accessible manner, because you should have the same access like any other employee. under EEOC, they talk about these equal employment opportunities. Well, one of those equal employment opportunities is promotion and is things like career ladders. So training is part of that, not just the onboarding, not maybe just like trainings like every year the staff has to do it. Those certainly have to be accessible. But if they're giving you professional development opportunities, those have to be accessible too. Okay, now I wish we had our sister agency with us. VIU said the Virgin Islands University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. They are our AT specialists here in the territory. Like I mentioned, they're our sister agency. They're based at the university. So if people want more information, contact information, who to outreach, be happy to provide that. Basically, AT is kind of what it is. It helps you. It's a technology that assists you. It could be anything from a wheelchair to, some people have even said pen and paper. So that's a very low maintenance AT. Of course, things that we think like screen readers, accessible software. We think about ergonomics, like I just mentioned about my back with ergonomics chairs. There's, could be potentially assistive technologies. So it's just anything that will help better the situation. Typically, it is something that's related to an addition or augmentation. Okay. Flexible work schedule, that's another one. Again, costs no money. And if that's a form of reasonable accommodation, we saw that a lot with COVID, where some people didn't want to be exposed during either high traffic time or customers. And so they would flex their schedule to be able to then accommodate both the business in terms of business necessity, but also accommodate the person with a disability. And then flexible leave. And this is actually a very long and complicated. You could do a training just on flexible leave. If you're dealing with that situation, again, call us. You have a right under the ADA to have flexible leave, even in addition to the leave that you already have, whether it's accrued time, vacation time, sick time, personal time. You have some additional rights that you can have flexible leave. It's not with pay, but it does protect your position. Okay. So I want to wrap that up and hand it over to Julian, but let me just wrap it up with some quick resources, and I'm going to hand it to you. Just so you know, Job Accommodation Network, a great resource is there, askjane.org. The Northeast ADA Center, which is our affiliate out of Cornell University, immense amount of resources. And of course, I have to include the EOC. There's a whole section just for job seekers and employees, a wealth of information, not too technical and definitely not too legalese. Okay. So before I hand over to you, Julian, Kishma, any questions anybody has for employment?
There's one, well, not sure if it speaks to employment, but there's one question. Which one of the titles speaks to program accessibility? And can you explain what that means?
I think that's going to fall under Julian next. So program access. So I
Correct.
think let's hand it to Julian. And if we don't answer, if he or we don't answer your question, let's bring it back up at the end. Okay.
So once again, good morning. And, when we talk about Title II, you talk about state and local government. And local government consists of, for us in the Virgin Islands, one of the largest employers or the largest employer that we have. And so as a government, we have lots of responsibilities. Prohibitive practices, things that you need to have in place as a government to make sure that you're not discriminating or not violating persons. You change the screen for me, Shami?
Oh, I'm so sorry. My mouse is doing some tricks. Sorry for that. Sorry.
Sorry, okay. So when you consider Title II of the ADA, this has a wide range of responsibilities. Any businesses that we have, you have to have not just physical access, but you have to also have electronic access. And that means if you're applying for something and you're an individual with visual impairment, you should have a way to be able to gather information that's on the government website or be able to contact that office based on whatever is needed. I know Shami covered a lot about required documentations of a disability. So when we think on the disability documentation, she spent a lot of time explaining as far as what your rights are. But as an employer, the employer at times want to have information that they feel might be pertinent in you doing your job. They do not have that right to assume that you need to disclose your disability or the requirements of your ability to be able to do the job, unless your job is in question and you feel that you're not performing to your best ability without an accommodation. At that time, you can then express the need for an accommodation. And that's not to the beginning of your job. That could be into your job, where you've been on a job and now you're being faced with vision loss or blurred vision, and you need larger fonts on your computer or other. Have a public event or spaces and it's not accessible. So if you work in, for instance, you work in a department and they're going to have an activity, and this activity is upstairs, and you're an individual with a mobility disability, they cannot discriminate and not have that event in a place where you can attend. However, if there's no other means of having this meeting or having this event, they have to bring that event to where you could participate in one way or the other. However, the best way is to make sure that they understand, if you learn of the event, to notify your employer that this place that you're planning for this event is not accessible. And with that consideration needs to be put in place to make sure that you have access to the same information and the same enjoyment that every other employee is experiencing on that job. So when you look at maintenance of accessible features, Shami touched on that also, as far as if you have equipments that needs to be repaired. Sometimes the lifts are not working, but you don't have any other alternate way to get to work. Then at that time, that employer would have to put in place a way that you could work remotely or work in a way that you can still perform your job. You wouldn't be put in a position where you're not employed or you're not on the payroll because you can't do the work because of equipment that's faulty. So anything that the government is required to have in place as far as any type of equipment that they use for you to do your job on a daily, you should report that information to your employer to make sure that they could make alternate plans for your day-to-day work. And no unnecessary inquiries. So if I'm an employer and I want to request or ask you for questions that's not of determining your job performance, then in cases like that, I cannot ask you, I need to know, as a person in a wheelchair, do you need special brakes, or do you need, they can't, those type of inquiries needs to come from you as an employee, not from the employer inquiring about your personal needs, and it doesn't have anything to do with the job itself. Shami, next.
Let me just also add, as we transition to the next slide, that with no unnecessary inquiries, just like Julian said, if you're a person with using a wheelchair and you're going to the BMV or you're going to, division of whatever, they have no right to ask you any questions about your disability at all. Okay.
So when we look at reasonable modifications, once again, Shami, you're going to go on this screen.
Sure, I can talk about this if you like.
Okay.
So one thing about reasonable one thing, the difference between Title I and Title II and III is reasonable. Under Title I, it's reasonable accommodation. Under Title II and III, it's reasonable modification. So just so we're using the right language. And under one of the provisions under Title II talks about effective communication. Again, this does run across the board as well. Just wanted to give some examples of what is effective. I think most people know what interpreters are, but there's also CART, which is a real-time a communication. Of course, Braille, far less people are using Braille. More people are going into either the electronic world using meaning like screen readers, but Braille does still exist. Large font. If you're, again, a public, if you're a state and local government, you're doing some marketing, you're doing some flyers, it's best as a best practice to use large font just in general. It's 18 font plus. That way you've accommodated and you've really had a kind of a universal way to do that. We talked a little, oh, go ahead.
Right. So, yeah, so I'm going to jump back in.
Sure.
So allow service. So service animals are also, as far as that accommodation, if you need to have a service animal on your job, that is something that needs to be granted. Keep in mind, a service animal is a requirement based on a disability and the accommodation that your dog or your service animal provides. And so there's only two questions that could be asked: is this service animal, this dog, because of a disability? And you could ask, what the dog was trained, but you can't ask them to have the dog perform any type of training or activities to show that this dog can do the things that you're in need of. However, as a person with a disability, you will be responsible for the maintenance or walking or doing anything with your service animal. You wouldn't be able to put in that position staff or other employees to then take care of your service animal based on, whatever you need the service animal to do during the course of the day. So like with the government websites and other information that the government provides, we're responsible under 508 to make our government accessible to everyone. So if you're trying to find out information and you're individual as blind, you should contact that department and explain what challenges, and they have to make that modification to fit your needs, because sometimes they post things and you could get the information, but then there's pictures on that document that because it don't have a box that actually describes the picture or diagram that's on that sheet, your reader wouldn't be able to pick it up. So information like that, you can then contact that department and explain and file your complaint in reference to not being able to gather the information that they have on the website because of whatever that is. Granting variances, I'm not sure where that goes, Shami. I'm going to have you touch on that.
So one of the reasonable modifications and examples under Title II with state and local governments has to do with granting variances. This is related to building codes. And so sometimes they can, establishments or entities can be granted variances so that they can do the accommodations or the modification. So it's this case by case, building by building, establishment by establishment. I believe this would be typically through, I was going to say licensing, but maybe not. Maybe it's through DPNR, but one of those divisions works on providing those variances for businesses. Do you want to jump back? Oh, you're on mute, Julian. You're on mute, Julian. No.
Simplifying processes. So when we look at simplifying processes, once again, it comes back to the government as a modification to find a way to make whatever processes easier for you as an employee. So if there's once again, you go back to a person with a mobility disability, and Shami talked about, the challenges that I had going to my office. So the process that they put in place was really challenging, because then I had to go on a pathway that was not as smooth and a distance that was extremely long, that if I didn't have upper body strength, that would have been definitely a hardship, and I would not be able to attend. So when I realized the process that was in place, I asked for an accommodation, and they were able to move the parking in a way that it made that uphill process a whole lot easier, and for me to be able to get to the office that I needed to get to. So a lot of times when you look at what is being put in front of you as a modification, you should ask questions if that modification is not meeting your needs, because by law, as an employer, I can't ask questions other than, is this modification meeting your needs? Or explaining what the modifications is and have your input within that modification to make sure that it's meeting your needs. Providing one-on-one assistance, non-medical or personal care. Once again, if you have a situation that you need to have one-on-one assistance, for instance, you might need someone to, because of an area that you need to traverse, that you need to ask an employee for one-on-one assistance in helping you through something. Now, we try to make sure that that process is eliminated. And when I say that because you should be able to have the modifications on your job that allows you to fully perform the same way that others perform. So for instance, I had a complaint, and Shami was there with an individual that had challenges in opening up or going to the restroom. Not because of the restroom itself, but because of the challenges that she had opening the doors. And until that modification was made, they provided her the assistance of one-on-one until the modification was corrected. So sometimes you end up not in a perfect world, but you have rights as an employee to make sure that the modification or the one-on-one assistance that's being provided is meeting your need without violating your rights as a person with a disability.
I will say, Julie, we have about 5 minutes to start to wrap up, and we certainly want to leave time for Q&A. Do you want to fly through Title III real quick, or how would you like to do that?
Right. So a place of public access, once again, Title III deals with public restrooms.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Back and forth too much. Go ahead. Okay, go right ahead.
So accessible entrances, access to goods and services, access to public bathrooms, access to other features like water fountains and websites. So when we look at accessible bathrooms, it's not just that the bathrooms is accessible, but you should have signage that tells you, because not every bathroom is accessible. So if you have a bathroom that's that you traverse for a long way to get to that bathroom to find out that it's not accessible. So whether it's accessible or not, signage is always a great thing to have in public places. We also make sure that theaters have the right seating that can accommodate you, water fountains. You have, when you go to the park or go to the playground, that they have accessible features to allow you to have access. And so once again, those modification that needs to be, or accommodation that needs to be put in place to make sure that they're meeting your needs, because it's a place of public access and the government is responsible to making sure that we have accessible crosswalks and on that meets your requirements as far as the public. Anything you want to add, Shami?
Yeah, I think also in terms of for place of public accommodations, when we talk to businesses, we try to break it down for them and say it's a 1, 2, 3 plus. Okay, entrance, good and service, public bathroom. Now, if they don't have a bathroom, they do not need to have one just for disability. If they don't have one, okay. And then we talked about the other features. So it's just a 1, 2, 3 plus when it comes to that. Just as a quickie, for as an advocate, as a person with disability, it's an easy way to remember what are those top 3 priorities. Okay. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay, you go, Shami.
Okay, so, and I do apologize, I know I'm speaking a little fast, and I think we might have put a little bit too much information in this PowerPoint, but if you can give us maybe 5 more minutes, we'll try to wrap it up as quick as we can. So we were talking about Title III. Again, this includes a retail. It also includes online merchants as well. It's not just brick and mortar anymore. So basically, some key things under Title III is readily achievable. That means basically what is readily available and achievable that without much expense or hardship or burden. Again, remove barriers that can be done easily and without much burden. That's their threshold in terms of what is reasonable and what is not. Checklist for existing facilities. This is something that's put out by a national organization that is very handy. So if you're a person with disabilities, you want to know what are the features, a little bit more details and the top 3 priorities plus. This checklist, I want to say, is about 12 pages long, so it's very comprehensive. Also, something that's important for businesses under readily achievable is universal design. Now, this is something that's out of the University of North Carolina, and they've got a wealth of information. We talk about the ramp, we talk about accessible websites. Those are all considered universal designs, and I would even include signage that Julian mentioned. And also for small businesses in the Virgin Islands count is that businesses are eligible for tax credits. So let's say you're at a business, they don't have accessible features or a service or a program or some sort of something, you think that maybe through a tax incentive could increase that. Let them know there's tax breaks and incentives that can offset the cost of providing accessible features. So do know that's only Title III. Title I, I think interchangeably could be used if it's employment and for the business. I think there's a way to do that as well. But Title II does not apply for tax credits. Just some quick examples as we wrap up Title III. The service animals, we've already talked about them. Just one thing I want to mention is that your service animal does not have to have an identifier, a jacket, or a vest. Okay. 2, rearranging shelves and items for customers. Again, this is no cost usually to the business. They can just go ahead and maybe rearrange some things. There's a certain width that's helpful to know for businesses, like 32 and 36 inches for wheelchair access, different types of reach range, and of course, protruding objects so people who have visual disabilities don't hit their head or run into things. So rearranging is, again, not too expensive, but a good way to become accessible. We talked about the one-on-one assistance already. We talked about accessible online presence and promotions, including promotions and sales. Again, they have to be accessible online just as much. There was a Supreme Court ruling that just came down last year that said online presence does fall under Title III. And accessible points of sales like registers, cashiers, online shopping, all of that needs to be accessible. And that's very key for businesses because the whole point of businesses is to make sales. Okay. So let's wrap it up and just talk about real quick, Title III, some resources. We kind of jumped over Title II, but Department of Justice enforces both Title II and III. The other slide had the technical system manual for Title II. Here's a one for Title III, absolutely easy to read, but very comprehensive. It's good to know about the Access Board because they do the design and architectural features of under the ADA. So the Access Board, if you ever want to know like historic preservation, or if you like to know what the ADAG is, which is the ADA accessibility guideline, you can get a copy of the ADAG. You can look at online. They've got videos. They've got just a wealth of information, everything to do with physical access. And then again, our colleague at Affiliate Northeast ADA Center, they've got information because they work with all titles of the ADA. So I think we almost did it in time. Again, I apologize for the quick talk. Just a lot of information, but we absolutely will stay if anybody has questions, and we open up to the floor to you guys. Any questions, Kishma, in the chat that we have? Feel free to unmute your mic. You know, this is a very informal training? I don't know if I know anybody on here, but feel free.
At present, we don't have any hands raised or anything in the chat. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand and I will open your mic so you can speak.
Like I say, you don't have to be shy. It's a very small group. Well, the good thing is that both Julie and I are on island. We work on island. So if you've got a question, you can give us a call, you can email us. You can also come visit us at our office. We still have a little bit of COVID protocols, but just give us a call. And if it's a situation that is better in person, we're happy to meet with you as well. Okay. Julian, I'm going to give you
Right.
some last words as well.
Right. And once again, as a government, there's a lot of things that's being improved. And if you find that you can't meet services, please don't hesitate to give me a call. Once again, my information is in front of you. My email address and my telephone number, 473-3523. As the ADA coordinator for the government, my responsibility is to make sure that people don't have barriers when seeking services within the government.
Great. And Julian's position actually comes out of Title II. It's in there about the ADA coordinator, the creation of one of them. And so Julian is that of Title II. Let me just end by saying that DRCVI, we are celebrating the ADA all week. We had our employee recruitment roundtable yesterday, and tomorrow we have our youth leadership forum. So feel free to go on our website and sign up for that. There's still plenty of time. If you're a person or you know someone who's between the age of 14 to 35 and they're interested in work, career planning, anything like that, let them know about DRCVI. We have a project called Career and Transition. I'd be happy, I'm the point person. I'd be happy to talk to that person and see if we can get some services and supports. And there's even a little bit of financial incentives that we have to participate. So with that, we just thank you very much for taking your time today. I know it's a lot of information. Again, feel free to follow up with us. We'll send the PowerPoint along with some brochures, and we'll make sure we do an overview of the ADA brochure from the National ADA Center. And with that, we just wish you a very good day and stay well and stay strong and stay happy. It's still a very difficult time with the pandemic. I know it's propping up again. There are people who are sick, so please just take care of yourself and take care of others. Julian, like to sign off?
Got you. And keep positive. Thank you and have a great day.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Take care now.
All right, before you guys sign off, I dropped in the chat a link to our evaluation for today's presentation. We ask that you take 2 minutes to complete that presentation. It's very important to get that feedback from the attendees as to the presentation made this morning. It gives us information as to, what you learned, or also ask questions as to what other topics or training that you would like to be done by our agency as well. So please complete that survey for us. I do believe after I end this session, it should pop up on your screen, but if not, it's in the chat as well. And again, I want to thank the presenters today, Mr. Henley and Ms. Carr, for such a wonderful, informative presentation, and to myself as well for being the host. Thank you.
That's right.
Great
And
job,
to
host.
everyone, thank you. Have a great day and be blessed as always.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care, everyone. Thanks again.